this back a little bit. There we go. Cool. You good?
All right, thanks everyone for joining us again. There's actually one more seat up here up front. Oh, sorry. Taken. Just kidding. But thank you again, everyone, for joining us tonight. And again, there's some additional seating up in the mezzanine. You can go up there by going around our bookshelves here and just making your way upstairs. You get kind of a bird's eye view, which I personally enjoy. So, great. So welcome. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us here at Printed Matter tonight for this exciting double book launch of both Gregory Sholette's The Art of Activism and the Activism of Art, and Andreas Huyssen's Memory Art in the Contemporary World. And first, I just want to thank Gregory, Andreas, as well as Nora for joining us tonight, and also extend a deep thanks to Social Practice CUNY for generously co-sponsoring tonight's event via the Mellon Foundation. And then just some quick logistical notes. We have wine and sparkling water over on that table right there. Feel free to get a glass now, and we'll also have some time immediately after the presentation. Copies of both books are available for sale. There are two you can flick through over there, and they're available for purchase at the register, so just make your way up to the front if you'd like to purchase either of them. And then as well, for anyone who needs the restroom, there is one directly in back behind all of the sets of chairs. And the key to that is going to be right on that shelf back there, right next to the drink station. You can always find one of us here at Printed Matter if you need help finding your way there as well. And now I'm just going to turn over things to Nora, who will provide a proper introduction to our speakers tonight. So, Nora, thanks so much.
Thank you. Thank you, and thanks to Printed Matter for hosting. And I'd also like to thank Greg and Andreas for inviting me to sort of be involved in this and provide an introduction. It'll be a short introduction because they both have a lot more to say than I do. I enjoyed being prompted to read both of their books. Sometimes in the middle of a semester, one puts things aside, and this ensured that they could not be put aside. So first, for formal introductions, Andreas Huyssen is the Arts Professor Emeritus of German and Comparative Literature at Columbia University, where he taught beginning in 1986. He is the founding director of the University's Center for Comparative Literature and Society, and one of the founding editors of New German Critique. In addition, he is author of many important works, including After the Great Divide and Twilight Memories, and a more recent book on photography and literature, German literature. Gregory Sholette is an artist, writer, activist, and professor of studio art at Queens College, CUNY, where he co-directs Social Practice, CUNY, with Chloe Bass. He has participated in, documented, and written about activist art for over 40 years. I have known both Andreas and Gregory for certainly more than 2 decades, in some cases perhaps 3 decades. I first came across Andreas's work as a graduate student when I was in comparative literature. And he was one of the few who, at that point, who was in both German and comparative literature, who was making forays into the field of comparative literature, writing in English, and really sort of making the thinkers and intellectuals of the Frankfurt School known. And his book, After the Great Divide, I think was on every single comparative literature master's comprehensive reading list. And it was a really important work for so many people, for myself included, and also because of its comparative nature, which always made me appreciate Andreas's work. Also, as founding editor of New German Critique, he was just so important in what was the most significant, I would say, journal in German studies in any language, German or English. And it really was groundbreaking. It introduced so many writers and texts, both to a German-speaking and to a non-German-speaking audience. So from very early on, there were early writings of Alexander Kluge, which he had not been translated into English, as well as many, many other thinkers. So thank you for providing us with that really important work. So Greg Sholette has been an activist, and I first, I think, met you one time when you were giving a presentation, maybe at University of Florida, on some of your work, and it was something I didn't know anything about, and I was like, it really sort of opened my eyes, and I was like, oh, so there is this whole other practice that is running parallel to, subterranean to, alongside of that of the more blue chip art world that I had then been familiar with since I was not trained in the field of contemporary art or art history, and I had been unaware. So it was really wonderful then, and since then we've seen each other repeatedly. So that's been great. Both of these works are almost like on two different sides of, so one could only say, the field. So Greg's approach is one still of activism and art, the relationship between the two. And Andreas is looking more at more established artists. Theoretically, what I found interesting was I could see my formation of my theoretical model. On the one hand, Greg was really going back to the situation as internationals, to Debord, to Society of the Spectacle, whereas Andreas's work is underpinned still by the Frankfurt School, by Adorno, yet the one figure who serves as a touchstone for both of them in this work would be Walter Benjamin. So I found that very interesting. There are many topics and many sort of crossings that we'll hear about. Some of them I was particularly interested in was Andreas's notion of Entgrenzung, which he takes. So this sort of, from Adorno, this dissolving or fraying of boundaries and borders. And Greg, your book very much is talking about when that border between being an activist and being an artist starts to dissolve in the present day. So I thought that was a really interesting sort of conjunction between the two, or confluence between the two. Both authors are writing and thinking with a future time available. That there has to be a futurist. I can't even say the word. There has to be a sort of future art, a future position that we need to move towards, and both from very different ways of looking. So I guess one thing which I'm interested in, and I'll pose the question now that we can sort of think about is, so what are the differences? So on the one hand, there's activist art. On the other hand, we have an art of memory. And are the two very different? And I was thinking about one quote from Andreas's where he says, and this is on page 17, aesthetic autonomy as a structural premise, both in the creation and the reception of art, is the dimension that distinguishes art from non-art as well as from agitprop. So I was kind of wondering then how that concept or how that idea would enter into conversation after your presentations. Thanks.
Okay, thank you very much for coming. I'm very happy to have been given the chance to speak here at Printed Matter. And thanks to the organizers. It was wonderful to see all the details so well planned and to see a big crowd now. Now, when Greg first suggested that we do an event together, you can all hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
When Greg first suggested that we do an event together to present and discuss our books, published in the Newland Humphrey series of books about contemporary art, I immediately took to the idea. Some time ago, it would have seemed counterintuitive to couple a book about political art activism with a book about currently highly successful gallery and museum art. This constellation would have been described in terms of irreconcilable opposites: high versus low culture, elite versus street art, real art versus mere propaganda or agitprop. In other words, art can be either autonomous or political. It can never be both. That was the consensus. Today, however, this distinction dominant in the decades of high modernism no longer holds in the same ways. And by today, I would say it's already been several decades when it has stopped to work in the old ways. And the contemporary memory art I discuss in my book certainly invalidates the distinction. Now, let me describe my book a little bit and give some background. I am part of the first post-fascist generation in Germany, so memory and forgetting have always been central to my life and to my published work for decades. The rise of the field of memory studies since the 1980s led me to observe and write about traveling Holocaust tropes and images in Latin America after the end of the dictatorships in Argentina and Chile, in civil war-torn Colombia, in post-apartheid South Africa, and in contemporary India. Doris Salcedo, who had read some of my earlier work on Holocaust memory in Germany, approached me for a catalog essay for one of her shows. So did Nalini Malani and Vivan Sundaram, both of whom I first met at a conference of artists, critics, and curators convened by Geeta Kapoor in Mumbai in the late 1990s. Guillermo Kwiatka and Marcelo Brodsky I met in those same years in Buenos Aires, where I was giving lectures about German memory culture at the Art Foundation POA. I was deeply touched by William Kentridge's drawing for projection, Felix in Exile, which I watched multiple times, almost obsessively, at the Documenta 10 in Kassel in 1997. I began to understand Kentridge's work better after I had met and interviewed him in Johannesburg during Okwi Enversor's second Joburg Biennial later that same year. But slowly my interest in how Holocaust memory functioned in other traumatic histories of violence gave way to exploring formal affinities among these artists from across the global south. The works of these artists first encountered each other and their viewers in third world biennials at the time of a growing international human rights movement and emerging cross-continental networks of truth and reconciliation commissions, memory museums, and commemorative projects around the world. By now, of course, their work has become quite successful, but they had just emerged into public consciousness when I first encountered it and started to write about it. Clearly, their work challenged me to think beyond German history and German culture, and it was specifically their use of Holocaust tropes and images that helped me overcome hesitations to write about art from parts of the world so far from my own expertise. Now, each chapter of my book discusses a few specific works by two artists from vastly different geographic areas and different historical contexts. These constellations are organized in the book according to common themes and forms: spaces of violence, shadow plays, or traveling trauma tropes. Or they focus on the spaces of installation itself, gallery, the museum, or urban space. Bringing these works into proximity with each other reveals aesthetic and political affinities as these artists negotiate their respective traumatic experiences by making imaginative use of received artistic legacies and practices, both local and transnational. The south-to-south axis of my juxtapositions is thus crossed by a south-to-north axis manifest in the ways these artists have all drawn on the archive of northern modernisms and postmodernisms, appropriating or counter-appropriating artistic strategies, techniques, and forms, and re-articulating them from their post-colonial perspectives. The third dimension, of course, is the north-south axis, present in my approach, which Nora mentioned, coming out of an expanded reading of critical theory, especially the aesthetic theory of Adorno. The book thus joins two dimensions of memory shared by my artists. Memory of national eruptions of recent state violence articulated from within, and the artists I write about all work from their home countries rather than from some Western art metropolis. And secondly, memory of a broad and diverse archive of the Western arts from the 20th century, Expressionism and Soviet revolutionary art in Kentridge, avant-garde dance theater in Kwiatka, minimalist sculpture in Salcedo and Sundaram, public urban installations in Salcedo and Kentridge, radical post-Brechtian theater in Nalini Milani. Now, much of this art relies heavily on installation and ephemeral performance while working out of older, sometimes obsolete mediums of art. By creating constellations of specific works across borders and boundaries, I have suggested points of affinity and contact among these artists from India, Latin America, and South Africa. Now, here are some examples. The motif of the empty bed to signify disappearance in Kwiatka and in Salcedo. Kwiatka paints on discardable cardboard an early series of works entitled Nadie olvida nada, Nobody Forgets Anything. Salcedo, in turn, transforms a bed frame, or two bed frames in this case, into sculpture with parts of the frame wrapped by bandages, pointing to an invisible wound. Absence of the disappeared is central to both. Then there is the effective transformation of minimalist sculpture in Salcedo and Sundaram. Salcedo creates furniture sculptures in her early work, armoires and chairs filled uncannily with cement in which residues of human clothing or bone fragments are barely visible, or mutilated tables in the series called Unland on the right in this image. The Unland, pointing to the Colombia of the Civil War as total dystopia. Sundaram's installation Memorial, which you see in this image, uses minimalist materials as well, but very differently. With its multiple references to the Soviet and American avant-gardes, Memorial is a cenotaph for the unknown fallen, a direct reference to a newspaper photo of a Muslim victim of the Hindu mob riots of 1992. The use of the shadow play as a major medium of memory is found in Malini and Kentridge, both of whom use stop-motion animation in their spectacular filmic installations. In her feminist work, Malani mobilizes Indian and European traditions of mythological narrative, mainly centered around women figures like Cassandra, Medea, and Sita and Draupadi from the Mahabharata epic, putting them into motion in her turning Mylar cylinders installations. Kentridge, in Procession on the left, and in one of the works from 9 Drawings for Projection, Felix in Exile, created several stop-motion animation films based on his graphic novel-like drawings, image on the right, which featured key existential and political issues of the apartheid and post-apartheid years, such as economic exploitation, mass protest, accountability, and truth and reconciliation, of which Kentridge was extremely critical. Learning from the shadows becomes a metaphor for learning from memory in these artists' very different use of the shadow play. And as I go on, somewhat superficially and too fast, no doubt, but we have time limits, Both Salcedo and Sundaram repurposed the very well-known Holocaust image of piles of worn shoes, transforming it into ways that inscribe local traumatic experiences into the work. Salcedo's shoes, embedded in relic-like in niches in the wall of the gallery, were found in mass graves. Sundaram's soles of shoes point to the slow violence of poverty in the Indian metropolis. The move outward from studio and gallery into installations in urban space is present in Kentridge's Rome fresco, Triumphs and Laments, which you see here on the left, which evokes the melancholy history of empire, from the foundations of Rome to migrants drowning in the Mediterranean off Italy's shores today. And also in Salcedo's allegorical reconstruction of the 1985 guerrilla occupation of Bogota's Palace of Justice, here on the left, and the ensuing massacre committed by the army trying to liberate the building. Or, on the right, in her Istanbul installation, in which empty chairs again signify death or lives turned upside down. Salcedo's memory installation at the Palace of Justice, which is both documentary and abstract, arguably had a significant impact on the later trial of those responsible for the massacre of 1985. Finally, both Salcedo and Sundaram created works of institutional critique as they temporarily transformed major museums in London and Kolkata, the Tate, Modern, and the Victoria Memorial Hall, drawing attention to their colonial heritage and its afterlife in the present. Salcedo created a crack all along the foundational floor in Tate Modern's huge turbine hall. She called it shibboleth, thus referring the spectator in an overdetermined way to the biblical story of a deadly crossing of a body of water, to contemporary migrants' death in the Mediterranean, and, as well, referring them to the exclusionary habitus of the Western outworld institutions. Lastly, Sundaram's history project, also a critique of the institution, refunctioned the Victoria Memorial Hall in Calcutta, a colonial building dedicated to the memory of Queen Victoria, Empress of India, into a space highlighting an alternative history of Bengal modernity under British imperialism. All of these works are loosely connected by the development of installation as form in combination with different artistic media, such as painting, sculpture, and drawing, or different technical supports, such as video, animation, and film. Ultimately, however, such affinities, and this speaks to the question of futurity and the future that our books both are concerned with, ultimately these affinities evoke, and I phrase this very carefully, a semblance of solidarity between geographically separated bodies of traumatic histories. But the work becomes an important aspect of memory culture at large, one that aims at new forms of cohabitation across cultural and geographic divides. Now, that said, I also want to say that I have no illusions about the power of art being able to move things substantively in the world. The demand Never Again, or Nunca Más in Argentina, already shipwrecked in the 1990s in Bosnia and in Rwanda. But I do have some trust in the power of art to create spaces of reflection and empathy, to question and challenge reified, official, and sanctioned memory, to create shared meaning in deeply divided societies, to strengthen demands for accountability, to sabotage organized forgetting, and last but not least, to resist the neo-fascist memory revisionism that has recently arisen in many parts of the world, ours here included. Such purposes can be pursued either by political art activism, the kind of direct, crisp, and cutting intervention in the public sphere that often resembles slapstick and draws on avant-garde techniques of estrangement and détournement, the work of, Gregory, of course, analyzes that dimension. Or it can be achieved by the temporally very different mode of what Doris Salcedo has called acts of memory, installations that require slow reception, active immersion and contemplation, both intellectual and sensual, in works and installations exhibited in gallery, museum, or open urban space. Two different forms of artistic intervention then, one quick, fugitive, and geared to immediate political effect, the other slow, endangering long-term effects, lingering engagement and enlightenment nourished by affect and emotion created through complex aesthetic means. Now to conclude, if I foreground the idea of aesthetic autonomy, which is sort of a bad term for many people, and has been a bad term for a long time, which is exactly why I want to emphasize it here. If I foreground the idea of aesthetic autonomy for such acts of memory, I simply mean to reassert the affective and cognitive power of artworks at a time when a relational aesthetic of immediate gratification, the aesthetic as commodified lifestyle and neoliberal enterprise culture, as Greg calls it, has taken over. In a world in which practically everything can claim to be aesthetic, it seems to me we need to guard or salvage the ways in which art can be understood, in Adorno's pithy definition, as both aesthetically autonomous and social fact. Thank you.
Thank you, Andreas. That was fantastic. I think we're going to see that there's going to be some interesting overlaps here and some interesting frisson, and we hope we can get into that with discussion. So let me jump in and tell you a little bit about the book that I put together. And again, it's part of the same series by Lund Humphreys, which was not the only reason that brought us together, but one of the reasons that brought us together. So the art of activism and the activism of art starts off with a speculative reflection on the Tate Modern's website quiz. And I don't suspect anybody here has taken it. Maybe you have. We'll do it after tonight. And I just have some screenshots. Oh, of course, this is also related to the introduction, which is that Black Lives Matter and the Me Too movement becoming part of 2020 power elite inside the art world, which I think is. But if you go to the Tate Modern's website and you take this quiz, it asks you this question. It's a challenge. Should you be in the Black Audio Film Collective, or are you a hackney flasher at heart? And you take the quiz to find out. So you ultimately, when you're done, you actually get offered a £5 membership deal for discounted tickets and 29% off on the cafe items. But what's really interesting is if you look down on the website and you scroll down, you find all of these art collectives, ones that I've written about and others have written about for years, listed right on the Tate Modern. What's really curious is that the Tate created the site in 2020, just about the time, endorsing, of course, politically engaged art collectors, just about the time that over 100 of the museum's own employees were staging a labor strike in protest of pandemic-related job cuts outside. And what struck me is that all, or maybe most of these collectives that are on the site would have exited cyberspace could they have done so, leaving it looking maybe something like this, or like this. But what's going on? When I started writing about art collectivism, 30-some years ago, this would have been impossible, that the Tate would have presented this work here on the Modern, etc. So something has really profoundly changed, particularly in the 21st century. So actually about a decade ago, I was asked by October magazine, it was in 2008, it was a special issue dedicated to sort of pointing out that there was a very tepid response by artists and academics to the invasion of Iraq. Maybe some of you remember this. And my contribution began with a very negative historical comparison. I pointed out that activism by artists and academics to previous atrocious political events was far more direct and confrontational. I then rattled off examples including guerrilla art action group or GAG staging a fake gun battle in front of the Museum of Modern Art to protest the war in Vietnam, or a little bit later in the mid-'80s, the broad coalition entitled Artists Call Against U.S. Intervention in Central America, which was organized as the omnibus series of exhibitions and events opposing what looked like the imminent invasion of El Salvador by the Reagan administration. This is 1984. And there's a traveling exhibition right now. I'm looking at Irina because she helped organize it over here. That's going to Chicago, to DePaul. Yeah. So my essay, concluded despairingly and really depressingly by insisting that activist art was a thing of the past and that it appeared inconceivable. Again, this is 2008. Today, nothing could be further from the current reality, and I pointed out already that Black Lives Matter was selected to be one of the top annual ranking of 100 art world influencers by a major art magazine. So along with this rising visibility, at the same time, activist art has undergone changes during this early 21st century, taking such forms as toppling monuments, holding art institutions to account for art washing, launching provocative events targeting the far right, and the treatment of refugees. The European curator Peter Weibel suggests that activism or art activism may be the first new art form of the 21st century. Philosopher Boris Groys insists that art activism is an entirely new phenomenon. Well, the book that I've written, Art of Activism, the Activism of Art, seeks to counter or perhaps even contradict these interpretations, or at least complicate them, by constructing what might be described as a credible backstory for art activism that stretches back decades in the case of this book, but if not centuries, if we actually consider the elaborate floats that Jacques-Louis David designed for the public festivals celebrating the French Revolution in the 1700s, or Gustave Courbet's role in the Paris Commune about a century later. So how can it be a new phenomenon? In some ways, I think Royce has a point. I think there is a newness to this phenomenon, and yet nevertheless, there's a complication to that. There's a historical haunting that's going on here. So my book really starts with a narrative in the post-war era, presenting a bottom-up, highly compressed story stretching roughly from the situations international, as Nora pointed out, in Europe, Tucumán in Argentina, and then it goes through the mass opposition and cultural movements of the 70s and 80s, pivoting on anti-war, anti-nuclear, anti-colonial, feminist, black, brown, Asian, indigenous, LGBTQ+, and other liberation struggles, into the tactical media practices of the post-Cold War era, the internet era, and then on to Occupy Wall Street, Black Lives Matter, and the recent unionization waves that's going on at museums, which I actually consider to be a kind of new form of institutional critique. We can talk about that. Largely because many of the people involved are actually artists who work as staff in these museums. And now we're in the current moment, which I call in the book the unpresent. And I'm going to come back to that in just a second. So at the same time, despite the sort of, obvious visibility of activist art, the book itself comes to a chronological ending point with this question of where we are now since post-COVID, but also post-Brexit, and of course post-2016 US elections, right? And what I try to do in the book, and I think this is one of the areas where we overlap quite a bit, is avoid really constructing a linear art history in the traditional sense. Even though it has this kind of chronological structure, I try to find ways to sort of disrupt that and problematize that. And one way to do that is talking about what I call the phantom archive. And that is to say, a fragmented and boisterous surplus reservoir of past experiments, repetitions, interventions, compromises, minor victories, and outright failures. To cite the feminist theorist Tirza True-Latimer, when it comes to subjects characterized by a pattern of historical invisibility and erasure, absences and apparitions are historically consequential. And reading Latimer in conjunction with Antonio Gramsci's point that history leaves behind an infinity of traces, but without providing an index or an inventory, I would say that the archival terrain of my book is always stretching towards a seemingly unattainable encounter with its own missing inventory. Ultimately, my study argues that this phantom archive manifests itself as a spectral pastness, or hauntology, to use Jacques Derrida's coinage, an off-screen presence that weighs upon every iteration of artistic activism today, regardless if the artists or the collectives involved really are aware of this history or not. And this is another area where I think our work connects with each other. I propose that artists frequently, if not perhaps always, engage in acts, activist artists in particular, acts of reuse, repurposing, and reactivation, as they knowingly or not mine this surplus stratum of the phantom archive. And one really clear example might be the way, say, Tactical Media in the 1990s and early 2000s, such groups as Critical Art Ensemble, the Yes Men, Sub Rosa, Center for Tactical Magic, among many others, repurposed earlier ideas of détournement and others from the Situationist International. But now here we are, following Brexit, following the US presidential elections in 2016. My ending, the last chapter of the book, and I'd be very interested to hear from people when they get a chance to read it, what they think, gets a bit dark. And I say we've entered the moment of the unpresent. It's an uncanny condition of social calamity that does not even falsely promise a return to business as usual, and in which every memory of better or more economic, political, or historical alternatives has faded away. Now, let me show you just a few quick examples. Of course, I start with May '68, but I also contrast it with this work by Josh McPhee, where he incorporated work from May '68, Paris in '68, into the present day in the streets of New York City. Again, trying to create this kind of connectivity between past and present. I mentioned these actions by GAAG. Imagine if somebody pulled a gun out today and set up smoke bombs in front of the MoMA to protest, and they actually, at one point, they grabbed the curator or someone who was supposed to be there, put them in the trunk of a car, and they drove off. In the 80s, the collective that I was part of with Lucy Depard, and she may be watching now, she was also one of the co-founders of this space when it was downtown, Printed Matter. We did work in the streets, we protested gentrification, we did way too many things, and collapsed fairly quickly, which is the fate of most collectives. Yes Men, the survivable, which you can, if you're a corporate executive and you can afford one, you can jump into this if it's a calamity of any sort, and basically it protects you against anything, natural, nuclear, whatever. And there's even a way you can suck the sort of life juices out of animals using the stomach system. So, of course, Occupy Wall Street. Here's Occupy Museums, one of the groups that spun off of Occupy Wall Street, entering the Diego Rivera exhibition at MoMA and saying, here you have like a famous communist artist, one of the first actually to be shown at MoMA, interestingly enough, in the 30s. Here you have a famous communist artist, and what is MoMA about today? Here we are talking about the very problematic of the museum. The Erroristas, picking up the, you might say, the drumbeat from Tucum and Arde. Here they're actually staging a marine landing while George Bush Jr.'s flight goes overhead while he was going to some conference in South America. So they're doing this directly under the flight plan. Another collective I've been part of, the Global Ultra-Luxury Faction in Gulf Labor, where we entered the Guggenheim Museum here in Manhattan in 2015 on May Day and unfurled this banner because we were talking about unfair labor practices in Abu Dhabi. That's, again, another whole presentation in itself. So far, that building has not been completed, but we expect that it's going to be underway soon. The actions against Warren Kanders at the Whitney Museum because of his involvement with the military technology industry, and one of our own, Aaron Burr Society, aka Jim Costanzo, protesting here. Actions going into museums and taking artwork out. This man, Dozobawa, is not an artist, he's an activist, but interestingly enough, he has influenced a great deal of activists, including Strike MoMA. And he, of course, goes in, he's from the Congo, picks up a work of art, African art, and tries to leave the building with it in Paris. And you see probably some poor intern trying to convince him that the actions against memorials, the creation of memorials here in Colombia, Black Lives Matter, a project that has incredible visual reminiscences with John Hartfield's work. Right? Again, Black Lives Matter, marching down the streets of New York, haunting us with the eyes of a slain Eric Garner. I mentioned briefly the organizational attempts by museum workers, staff workers. Here is the Whitney Museum, New Museum staff. I think the first to really begin this wave of sort of unionizations in New York. But also over in Bilbao, here's the group of kitchen workers basically on staff and cleaning staff saying, we've had enough. The work of the Center for Political Beauty in Berlin. Some of you may know this piece, where they actually got property right across from one of the leading far-right candidates, fascist, or let's say neo-fascist, should I just drop the neo? Candidates in Germany. And under TARP, they constructed the Holocaust Memorial that's in Berlin, a miniature version of it. And this was his summer home or his country home, and they pulled it off one day. And there he had to look out and see this memorial, which he had once said was a memorial to cowardice or something along those lines.
To the shame of the nation.
The shame of the nation, exactly. Or more recently, Ukrainians and Poles marching together in the streets of Warsaw, protesting the intervention of the Russians, the war of Russia on Ukraine, or artists in Ukraine, here in Kyiv, their artists building like what look like minimalist artworks, which are in fact anti-tank devices. So I'll just read very last paragraph from my book, and then I'm going to ask Andreas a question, which we're going to start this kind of back and forth. I end the book saying, poised between a desire to escape or to abolish a barbaric civilization with its concocted glorious white past, or the militarized reassertion of ethno-religious netherworlds, and the contrary need to embrace some concept of a better future, perhaps even reimagining the innovative state governance of the 1930s U.S. New Deal, or what contemporary French economist Thomas Piketty describes as socialism rethought. Hardly radical, but perhaps realizable. We witness the contemporary art of activism and the activism of art conjoin into an indivisible contingency. Whether contemplating a prison break together, or a revolution, or merely the reconceptualization of existing institutions, it's a time-space haunted by the elusive dream, referencing here Martha Rosser's quote, of historical agency and its unceasing hunger for total emancipation. Now, let me ask a question for Andreas. Both of our new books have significant overlap around the theme of memory in relationship to contemporary visual art practices, as Nora has pointed out in you. You say memory is another form of forgetting, and forgetting is a form of hidden, evaded, or ignored memory. Rather than being fixed in time and space, some pasts might shrink, while others would expand and proliferate in the course of time. The observation deeply resonates with my research, teaching, and practice, insofar as I'm constantly focusing on how the past informs the present, even if in unrecognized or often unexpected ways. That stated, my book presents a bottom-up account of the phenomena, from the margins, so to speak, rather from the institutional art world, which is why I ground my narrative in what I call the phantom archive, which I've described already. But our ideas converge again around a critique of linear art historical accounts. We also both make efforts to avoid the trap of melancholy and nostalgia by addressing the relationship between memory on one hand and future possibilities that are opened up within the present through certain forms of activist art and art. You write, rather than locking us into the past, arcs of memory art have an eye, or have in the present have an eye towards the future. So this constant sort of moving and shuffling back and forth, right? So I wonder if you could expand a little bit more on your notion of futurity, how it inhabits the present, and how you see memory art maybe addressing it or unlocking it.
Well, I have to say that I'm always a little hesitant to address the future. And I'm a historian and not a prophet. So that said, I want to begin at the other end with my answer, perhaps, and say that I completely agree with you with the overlap of our books, because both books are directed against the power of forgetting. That is a key kind of element, and we both seem to be skeptical of the potential success of that project, although we put our hopes into that project. I loved your term of the phantom archive, and I take it, and correct me if I'm wrong, that it's just another way, somewhat different way at a different scale, to talk about what you described at an earlier time in your other book, dark matter. And except that now the phantoms are there, and in dark matter everything is dark. But anyway, and you described the book very, very well. It's exactly what struck me, that you give not a teleological narrative, that would say, for instance, that there was the situation is international, and now it all comes to a head with Black Lives Matter. But you give us a very fragmented kind of, I would of course say history, but the term is wrong in this context. You give a backstory. I love that term. You give a backstory of developments over the decades, and I must say I've learned an enormous amount of that, because many of these groupings I had never even heard of. I mean, I know the situation is international. I know ACT UP and the AIDS protest movements. I know Occupy Wall Street and a few others. But there is incredibly rich material in this book. But doesn't the book itself, there would be a little question to you, don't you have the hope also that it gives a kind of presence, a new presence that people can work with to this phantom archive, which thereby is perhaps less phantasmatic than it might otherwise be?
Yeah, that's great. I hope it's useful, and I think it sounds like it is in terms of precisely showing things that people don't know. And it doesn't present a teleological version of history. I think that's super important, and I want to expand on that as I work on the next book. But I do think, this question of the Phantom Archive, I mean, it really comes back maybe to the question or the idea that the Situationists raised, which was a total change, a total sort of decapitalization, right, project. And I think what we've entered into recently, especially in what is sort of like called post-structural ideas, is that opposition takes place in a much more fragmented way. It happens on the margins, it happens intermittently. There is no sort of unified sense of like, okay, how do we bring about a change? Of course, the Situationists were working with a Marxist notion of totality, highly problematic, a grand narrative, we got it. Nevertheless, capitalism is also a grand narrative, let's face it, it is totalizing in many ways. So I think the Phantom Archive is partially this very notion of total emancipation, haunting any work, even a work that thinks it's only working in a very sort of limited way. And so I wonder if I want it to be, or anyone should want it to be completely visible, whether it needs to be a phantom. Let me ask you another question, and we're going to open it up to you guys in just a couple of minutes.
Well, let me, okay, now go ahead. I have some questions for you too.
Good, okay. All right, well, let me throw one back at you, a real short one. Another connection between our books is that you point out, and here's a quote, obsessions with the past sit side by side with an interestingly flat present of the status quo, the great paradox in contemporary culture, which I described in this post-Brexit, post-2016 period as the unpresent. And it's a kind of peculiar hauntology that's being presented. And again, I think Martha Rosler's comment, the artistic imagination, continues to dream of historical agency, does a good job of sort of summing that up. So precisely, the artists that you present, they're not trying to make major political or historical statements. I mean, I don't believe that's exactly what they're doing, as you point out. Nevertheless, there's a kind of sense in which that classic avant-garde idea of real historical change still runs through.
There's an urgency there.
An urgency, exactly. So I wonder how you would sort of see that question of maybe the avant-garde even in this sort of set of works. Does it have any relevance today?
Well, it's an interesting question. I would say probably yes and no. The very concept of the avant-garde is predicated on the idea that there is a group way out in front of the masses, you know, and it is tied to a notion, teleological notion of history. To that extent, not. But since there are many practices that are on the cutting edge of new technologies, cutting edge of certain media, etc., I would say that there are, perhaps one can say that the possibility of avant-garde art is still possible, but it's avant-garde with a small a and not with a capital A. I know that's a kind of simplistic way of speaking about it. Now, I've had, in my exchanges with the artists of my book, I mean, for instance, with the artists and, you know, critics that have influenced me, you know, Geeta Kapoor, the Indian critic, has labored a great deal around this issue. Is the Indian art of somebody like Nalini Malani or Vivan Sundaram can it be called avant-garde? And her answer is also tentative, but I think there is a kind of, the avant-gardist notion is still enables us to zero in on the urgency of that kind of work. And avant-garde is political, is explicitly political. The historical avant-garde was explicitly political, and so is this memory art. So I would say, what was the question?
I think you answered it. Yeah, a complicated. It's your turn to answer this question.
Well, I was curious in your description, you raised it in the description of the book itself, the sort of shade, the surprise that museums do kinds of things that 50 years ago or longer they would have never done. So let me take the example of this grouping that you had created and were active in the 80s, I guess, late 70s and the 80s, the group Political Art Documentation / Distribution. The materials of that group are now being archived by MoMA. Now, what does that mean? In the 70s, we would have said co-option, or, in a more philosophical way, artificial negativity. Okay? But the question then really becomes, you know, how will you respond to that kind of reproach? And I think if I look at the book, if I'm right, some answer emerges from the chapter on institutional critique and demolition.
You know, it's interesting because I can only say so much about this, but you keep your eyes open. Within the next month or so, there's going to be a big announcement about this very archive we're talking about, which is really linked directly to this institution as well, since Lucy Lepard was involved in both. But the moment is not only, we actually, the collective actually did the archiving and did all the indexing of it and gave it to MoMA. Wasn't exactly my decision. Collectives get to make decisions and you don't always agree, and I think it's been that way with a number of collectives I've been with. But nevertheless, it is a paradox, and it's a complicated paradox, and part of it is because a number of the people in the collective had a direct relationship, including Lucy, to that institution, which is, in a certain sense, this kind of paternalistic thing, right, that sits in the middle of New York and the world in a way in relation to art. But I do think, as you helped me out of the question by pointing to the fact that, yeah, artists are now working, many artists are working, I myself worked at the New Museum, and we, you know, working in these institutions and finding a way now to rethink, I think, institutional critique from deep within inside the institution itself. It's no longer an artwork that people are creating, it's literally the mechanism of the institution itself, and calling on the institution to live up to a kind of higher standard of what it should be. So maybe there's hope there. That's a longer discussion. But I will just end with one thing, and I know we want to get on with other questions. It's ironic because I was the curator of education in 1998 at New Museum when Doris Salcedo's exhibition came there. And it was unland, and it was precisely the works that you showed initially, these beautiful works that were sort of, you know, reworked over in many ways. And I was doing an exhibition called Urban Encounters, which, because of internal programming and issues that I can't even get into, had to be postponed for several months. But the idea was precisely an encounter like this. Doris Cicero in the upstairs space, and in the downstairs, which is where the education was, space, an exhibition including Guerrilla Girls, including ABC No Rio, including Godzilla, and so on and so forth, right? Creating the singular fusion. A missed opportunity that I feel like we've sort of recreated tonight in a certain way by bringing these two books together. Anyway, I'm going to end it there, and I know we want to get some questions from you folks before we.
Can we just get a round of applause, please? Thank you both so much. Amazing. Thank you both, Greg and Andreas, for being here again, and for that wonderful presentation. And now I just want to open it up to you all. I can be the sort of traveling mic for anyone who might have a question, so feel free to call me over and I'll pass it off to you to direct Greg and Andreas. Any questions? Making sure I don't miss the folks up on the balcony as well.
Thanks a lot. That was very interesting. I came in a bit late, so I missed a little bit of Andreas's presentation. But I've always been struck that in places where there isn't a market for art, artists come together in collectives because they become their own interlocutors. Whereas markets tend to individualize artists and they function as sole producers. And Andreas, in your book, almost all of the artists are very successful in a market. I mean, they have, perhaps with an exception of one or two, but what kind, whereas the counter would be in Greg's book, where I think there's market paucity in terms of a lot of, the artists are supporting themselves, they're sharing whatever resources they have amongst themselves. What are we to make about that distinction, given the many similarities you just drew between your two projects? But there is a distinction, and it's an economic one.
And I don't know, it's a very broad kind of question, but I think it, of course, goes back to the question of high versus low, ultimately. Now, what has changed in this constellation? I mean, I try to think about it. It used to be vertical, right? High versus low. It's in the language itself. But the purpose of that distinction was always to dismiss low, to not allow even anybody taking it seriously. And that has changed, I would say, probably in the 1960s, 1970s, with the beginning of a kind of what I called at that time a critical postmodernism. Critical postmodernism, not what then happened with postmodernism in the 1980s. But this high-low distinction has been laid flat at this point. And the work of the artists I discuss, who are very big in institutions, they're able to raise a lot of money, they get a lot of prizes, etc., is at one end, is clearly at one end of that line, which reaches from, in the past from high art to low, or now from museum art to the type of art activism that is the topic of Gregory's book. So I would say that there is still that old kind of distinction. But do I want to judge it only on that basis? No, I don't. Because these artists have become enormously successful, there's no question about it, and one can articulate all kinds of critiques of, with some of them, I won't mention any names now, who keep repeating themselves in very obvious ways, doing the same thing over and over again. I mean, I mentioned one, Anselm Kiefer, somebody whom I've written about a long time ago, but that's a German word, it's not part of my topic here. So I'm very aware of that, and I'm happy that you raised that question. It's a question, of course, that is not raised in my book at all.
It's a great question, Alex, and a really difficult one, I think, because when I wrote, say, Dark Matter, which was almost 10 years ago, right? That question would have been absolutely no-brainer. The artists that I was talking about had no relationship to the market, or very little relation to the market, or an antagonistic relation to the market, or even just one of